Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today on Todos Santos, we're doing a build that I kind of started on a whim. We're taking the metro line, the two light rail lines, the BRT line that you see here, adding two suburban rail lines, and making a central station for the city. Now for about 20 or 30 episodes, I've had this place lined up to become some sort of transit station. It just happened to be where three of our rail lines met up, and we also have the BRT line that ran across there. Of course, we're deleting all this now because we need to make it from scratch, because the plan changed a little bit, because we're also going to be adding in two commuter rail lines. Now for a while I had thought that Todos Santos wouldn't be the kind of city to have intercity rail, but I honestly just really wanted to do a build like this. So we're going to be adding those and connecting everything up into a single train station that also serves BRT and normal buses as well. Now, Puerto Rico used to have passenger rail in between cities, although I believe all of those lines have since been abandoned in favor of the car and other transit services. I do have some information in the description if you'd like to learn a bit more about that. I'm by no means an expert or anything, I'm just going off a couple of sources that I looked at. And we're not using anything in particular for inspiration for this build. I just wanted to go crazy with my imagination and build a transit center. Now, obviously this is called the Central Station, and it's not really in the center of the city. So it's more on the western side of town, which we've mostly been developing on live streams. So what I'm imagining is this part of the city used to be a separate town that's since been absorbed by Todos Santos. So initially it was an industrial town that was served by industrial rail, much like in real life in Puerto Rico. Rail lines would have been built to serve various agriculture and industries, primarily the sugarcane industry. So this town sprung up around that and it's serving the rail lines that made that function. And so this is why all the intercity rail is terminating here and not in the center of the actual city of Todos Santos. And so the history of the rail would be that even though the lines became abandoned and disused, they still maintained the right-of-way that they had. And then eventually they were able to take that and lay down new track in order to use it for passenger rail. So even though much of what the town used to look like with historic architecture is no longer, they still have some remnant of what this place used to look like with the path that the rail takes through the town. I don't actually have a name to represent this old industrial town that has since been absorbed into Todos Santos. Let me know if you have a good idea for that. Now, I mostly wanted to build an open-air station with a couple of small buildings, and these wouldn't be the original buildings like you would have had in San Juan, which is now, as far as I can tell, a parking garage and bus depot. But these would be modern buildings built in the style of the older ones. So I'm using these Mediterranean train stations. These are by the same creator as the Mediterranean Castle we used a few episodes ago to make the fort, High Explosive Serenade. Again, fantastic username, fantastic assets. I'm using this terminus station for one of the rails because it has the building on this one end, and then we're also going to be adding a non-terminus station next to it because it has a building on the other end. So that way we have a building facing either road, which I think just seems kind of handy. So it's a little easier to access. Of course, both of these will actually be serving as terminus stations. We're not going to run the suburban rail all the way to the downtown or the old town or anything. I mean, that would be pretty cool, but just thinking realistically, they already had the right-of-way available to this location, so it would be a lot cheaper and more straightforward just to build rail here instead of having to tear up a bunch of land, tear down houses, just to be able to get the rail a little bit farther. Anyway, we have the light rail lines and the metro, which can then carry people from this station into the city. So I think it will work well enough in terms of actually moving people around. Now, of course, we have to actually simulate the fact that this rail has been here for a while. So we need to figure out how it's going to make its way through the city and out into the suburbs. We're actually going to connect it up to the suburbs at the edge of the map that I made back in episode 55. I made one on the eastern side of town, one on the western side of town, and one in the south, in the mountains. We're only going to connect up to the eastern and southern ones in this episode. Potentially we'll do the western one at some point as well, but for now we're just doing the two nearby ones, which are east and south. I like doing it this way and creating lines that go back and forth between the stations, as opposed to doing it with the game's built-in outside connection function, because it just allows me to control how many trains go back and forth. It's easier to control the vehicle models that we use, and it's just generally easier to control how it looks and how it functions. The outside connections can get a little weird sometimes, so I just wanted to do it manually instead. We're not going to detail the outskirts of the rail at this point. Obviously, we're going to have ugly bridges and unrealistic inclines and all that sort of stuff. We're just going to detail those areas as we get to them in other builds in future episodes. But for now, I just wanted to connect it up and make sure we can get everything functional, and that'll set the stage for all the fun detailing that we'll do later. So now we're at our horrendously ugly suburb at the southern end of the map. I'm just going to add in a vanilla train station because I don't really care what this area looks like. I don't feel the need to tailor its architecture to the city of Todos Santos. It's just there for functionality. So like I said, I'm going to connect up a line. We're going to call this commuter rail south just so I can keep track of things. And I'm using this Acela Express model. I really like how it looks, and I feel like it just fits in with the theme of this being a more modern, up-to-date railway that has been recently implemented. Now we're heading back over to the eastern side of town. If you've watched the live streams, this place probably looks a little less developed than you're used to. That's because everything in the series is completely out of order. I recorded this episode between the first live stream and the second one, so a lot of the stuff we did is missing. But of course, at the end of the series, everything will all mesh together and work and function. I think where the rail runs next to the freeway here, it's probably going to make more sense to eventually move it over up next to the freeway, like they have all this transit in one right-of-way area, instead of having to worry about it branching out here and kind of taking up more space than it has to. But for now, we're just going to leave it as is and connect it up to another station, make another line, and start getting some people coming in from the edge of the map. It's kind of nice because people will actually, like normally they would spawn at the edge of the map and then, jump in a car, or they would spawn in a train and come via an outside connection. This still kind of maintains that functionality because people will spawn at the edge of the map in our suburb, then they'll hop on the train line that we've created and take that into town. So it still actually functions as an outside connection, without all the downsides that come with the vanilla version of outside connections. Okay, back at the station, now that we have all our inputs and outputs, I guess you could call them, we need to figure out how this station is actually going to be arranged. Obviously right now it's just the two commuter rail lines, which isn't all we have coming in here. We have two light rail lines as well, so we need to make a little bit of room for those. And then we also have the BRT, and I wanted to integrate all these things so they all look like they're pretty much in one station. Like it's not just things that have been added on one after the other. It's all fairly cohesive visually speaking. So I'm turning the train stations into POs just so I can access the platforms and reuse those without having to worry about clipping the buildings together and all that kind of stuff. I just want the platforms. And then I'm changing their length by just moving some of the vertices around so that they fit the actual station length for these light rail vehicles, which are obviously a lot smaller than the commuter rail vehicles. I tried something weird with this split station track. I thought it would be kind of interesting to have two of the light rail lines stop on the same track just to as a way to conserve space, but the game did not like that. It wasn't just a matter of not being able to select the proper track. There's something about having two lines clipped into each other where it just won't work. So I ended up having to scratch that, and they each just end up getting their own platform, which I think is perfectly fine. It just takes up a little bit more space, and it ends up looking better, and it ends up actually functioning. Unfortunately, my silly plan didn't work, but that's usually the case anyway, so I'm not too worried about it. Anyway, the next thing is a little bit more straightforward, and that's the BRT. So I'm just taking the BRT bridge here that I made across the avenue, adding a little turnaround, and then we're going to lower this down to ground level. The station is actually sunken quite a bit just because of the way I needed various pieces of infrastructure to cross over one another. Anyway, we're going to take the BRT road and extend it out here along the platforms by the light rail, and the BRT is of course going to get its own platforms as well, because I wanted this place to be fully integrated, and I don't know, I just thought it would be cool to have all these different kinds of transit running along next to one another in a nice consistent building that really looks like they put this all together in one go. So I'm just going to line those platforms up, and then we're going to take our BRT lines. If you remember back to the BRT build, we have just the normal line, and then we have an express one. It's mostly for visual purposes. Go check that build out if you haven't seen it yet. Anyway, one of them is going to stop on one platform, and one of them is going to stop on the other, just to try to reduce congestion a little bit. Because I found if you make a bus station and you have a bunch of buses stopping at the same spot, it's not going to be a good time for traffic. Now this Mediterranean University building, by the same creator, I believe, I thought would serve as a nice main building for the station, because I didn't want to do anything too tall or wide. I just wanted something nice and simple, that fit the theme with the train stations that we used. So that would be like the main building where you could go in and get your tickets or wait for a train or get some food or whatever. Now I'm taking these Moscow metro stations because I think they look nice and generic without the identifiable Moscow metro props attached to them. Unfortunately, I can't turn them into POs because it messes up the glass that's built into them. So I have to place all these actual functional metro stations down just to get the visuals here. Because I would like to represent that from any of these platforms, you'd be able to access the metro. So they have these access areas going down into the underground metro area. And I also wanted people to actually be able to get around without walking across the tracks. So we have a system of sunken pedestrian tunnels, which obviously looks horrendous and is totally unrealistic as it is, but nobody's actually going to see it, so I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to upgrade all these into the invisible versions. They still poke through though, for some reason, even though they're invisible, theoretically. So I have to lower them way down. But again, it's all about the functionality here. There are some gaps that form when you lower them down, so off camera I came back and put down some ploppable gravel to cover it. And I also put down some ploppable grass on this weird little triangle where the rail goes underneath the road. And of course we also need to cover up this gap with some retaining walls. And we actually have a lot of this sort of stuff that we need to do. So let's take care of that, clean up how this area looks, and then we'll get to detailing the station itself. I wanted to have two themes for this station. This side is the more decorative side because it's not right up against the track. So we have our usual palette of trees, some grass, and a nice wall running along the avenue. The other side is going to be more practical. It's just going to have a fence right along the track because you don't want people, jumping onto the track for whatever reason. Not usually a good thing to do. Anyway, on this side, there's a small employee parking lot. Of course, this is not the only parking lot we're going to build. We're going to do a big park and ride one in a minute. But first I wanted to do this. I'm just manually placing props instead of doing functional parking because it just felt like the right thing to do. I wanted to have it always be full and busy because this is a place that would employ quite a few people. So there would always be people working here and parked here. And instead of just doing the usual grass medians here in between these BRT and regular bus pull-throughs, I just thought it would be more interesting to have some, I guess it would be gravel or dirt or something. Anyway, they just have that with some nicely trimmed hedges and the usual palette of trees. And while I was over here, I thought it didn't quite seem right to have this nice station building just be totally unused and turned off. So I decided to go through and add some of these service blocks. So we have some commercial, of course, because you would have little shops selling things for people who are taking the train or the bus or whatever. I also added a couple low-density residential blocks because I imagine that there's always going to be someone sleeping here, waiting a long time for a train or whatever. They don't want to go get a hotel and spend money on that. So someone's going to be spending the night at the train station. And I figured that that would just technically inflate the population of Todos Santos by a few people here and there. So I just added a couple of those to represent that. Then, as I mentioned, this side of the station is quite a bit more utilitarian than the other, so we just have a chain link fence keeping people away from the track. Covered up some of this ugly clipping here from the terrain with a couple of props, and just added a few trees here and there to spruce it up just a little bit, make it look a little bit nicer, even though it's not quite as landscaped as the other side. So now that we've got the station mostly done, we need to take care of this area that surrounds it. Where the avenue splits out to go around the track, the result is a few weirdly shaped blocks. So I wanted to fill one of these in with the park and ride parking lot that I was talking about before. So there are going to be a lot of spaces here, of course. I'm just going to skip through that, and because you've seen me do so many of these parking lots by now, and we actually get a lot of people drawn to this vicinity, so it ends up being filled with cars, which is pretty nice. Of course, there's no such thing as free parking in Todos Santos, certainly not free park and ride. So you gotta pay to get in, using these parking lot entrance assets by Spence. Love this set, really good for this kind of build. It's a very plain parking lot, there's no fancy stuff here, so just a chain link fence surrounding it. And then just the standard stuff to take care of a parking lot: concrete brushes, surface painter, decals, parking lot lights, park and ride sign, and last but not least, trees. Now there's another block in between here and the station itself. I thought this might be a good spot to have the city's main transit offices. I'm using this fantastic Paraguayan tower by Watermelon and clipping it into a standard generic office building. I just thought it felt like it needed a little bit of extra acreage on the ground floor, so we have that there. I needed to make it fit into the BRT road with PO. Kind of annoying to do this sort of thing, but I think the final result is nice because it just breaks it up a little bit from all these rectangular buildings that we have in the city, and I think even little details like that can make a building really, really unique. I'm going to rename it the Transit Authority of Todos Santos, because that's exactly what it is, and might as well just have a generic descriptive name. This would be where all the administration would take place for all the different bus routes and train routes and everything that we have in the city. So I thought it would be nice to have a dedicated place for this, and instead of just like imagining that they're renting some random office in a high-rise in the downtown or whatever, just gives it a little bit more character, and it kind of makes sense that it would be right next to the main central station for the city. I'm adding a couple office blocks to make up for the fact that we turned that office building into a PO, and also color matching it with the tower, just so it looks a little bit more like a single building. There were a couple parts of this build that I was kind of avoiding the whole time that I was working on it. One of them was how ugly this overpass, where the road goes over the rail, looks. So I wanted to go in and quickly fix that up, mostly with some retaining walls, as you saw before, but also with some PO. So I'm just using these prefab house walls, making them a lot bigger so that they look like they could actually support this kind of weight of this road going over top. And then just having these little, I don't know exactly what you would call them, but just something to cover up the berm on the road. Because obviously we're not using the elevated version of the road, because it doesn't really make any sense, honestly, to have an elevated road with barriers on both sides if the whole point of building this kind of thing is to have land in the center where it looks like they have, dug out these rail lines and then covered it back up with a tunnel. I don't know if that makes any sense, but like I just don't want to use the elevated versions if it doesn't make any sense to have railings on both sides of the road. So anyway, that's why I needed to do ground level versions of the road, which of course means we need to take care of all these ugly things remaining here. This one was a little harder to do because it curves before it goes under the road, so I'm just kind of tediously and imperfectly rotating it with Move It just a little bit. I think the result is good enough. I'm not too worried about it not being a perfect curve. So now that I finished that, I was ready to move on to the part that was really intimidating to me. Actually, I got distracted by this first, but once that very strange issue got resolved, I finally decided to fill in this horrible triangle here. I just had absolutely no idea what to put. I didn't want to just do another parking lot or like a generic block of buildings or anything. I wanted to do something interesting because this is like a feature point of this build where the rail goes underground for a minute. Obviously, they would have a good reason to have this happen because that's like a fairly big feat of engineering as far as I understand it. So I wanted to do something interesting here. Now, on one side, I just had a normal commercial block. That's not really unique. But then on the other side, I wanted to do a couple of more interesting things. So I don't know if this is like structurally sound to put this big of a building on top of a tunnel like this, but we're going to do it because I thought it would be cool to have a giant apartment building right here. I just need to fit it into the landscape a little bit with some ploppable pavement. I also thought this was a nice little alcove for some benches here. And right next door, there's this very nice restaurant. And again, I need to fit this into the landscape with PO this time. Just selecting all the vertices along one wall and rotating them so that they line up with the street. And because this is on top of a sunken railroad, I can't really do any functional parking because all the parking spots will fall down to follow the terrain, so I have to just put down a bunch of props instead. I figured this would be the sort of place where you'd probably want at least a small parking lot to serve the apartment and maybe the restaurant as well. Now that we've gotten the kind of iconic parts of this filled in, there's just a couple more details to make it look unique. I thought it might be fun here to have a little train spotting part, maybe just as a reference to the railroad heritage of this area. I actually wanted to put down like an old steam engine, or like at least a statue of one, just to kind of emphasize that, but I didn't actually have anything in my collection, so I might take a look on the workshop and see if there's anything that would represent that I could put down. Other than that, though, it's pretty simple. There's just a very simple path system that winds through the park. There's a nice oak, and then there are a couple benches sitting by the rail line. Obviously, it's just the light rail on this side, but I think that would still be worth, checking out every once in a while. And then just some more landscaped-looking trees and bushes, not like the super wild park that I tend to like to make. And then we just need to give it a name and extend our bus line out here. Now that's it for the details of the build, but we're not done with the episode yet. So as we do builds in the series, I want to start adding more context to them, because I feel like the scale of Todos Santos isn't quite there yet, isn't quite where I want it to be. And I think what we need is just giant pockets of low-density residential neighborhoods scattered around. So anyway, as we do feature builds in the series, like the Central Station, I want to add in neighborhoods surrounding them, at least where it makes sense to have neighborhoods. So we're going to quickly lay down a road network. If you want to see this sort of thing in more detail, I did some of this on the second live stream of Todos Santos. You could go check that out. We've done some in earlier episodes as well. But I'm just taking inspiration from the equivalent area in San Juan, working on a fairly irregular grid, and extending that through this whole area, because I really would like it to be a pretty vast area of this sort of road network. Now over here, there's a little bit of a resurgence of high-rises. So we have the big tourist area to the west here over left of screen, and then there's a bit of low density in between, and then right here, for whatever reason, there's popped up another fairly high density area. So I'm just putting down a few of these to represent that, and I filled it in off camera with some details and some more buildings just to flesh it out. But it's very similar to what we built in episode 36, that high-rise tourist area. And then we filled it in with the normal slate of houses that I'm sure you're very familiar with if you've followed the series up to this point. Another thing is that while I was working on this, the population was slowly ticking up and up and up, and we finally hit 200,000, which is that was my original goal, to make a big city, to get Todos Santos to 200,000. What do you think? Do you think we can hit 300,000 by the end of the series? I think that would be a good goal to set for the series. That's it for the Central Station of Todos Santos and environs. I really hope that you enjoyed your time in the city today, and I can't wait to see you on the next one. Bye-bye.